I pushed open the heavy wooden doors of St. Clement's Church expecting to see flowers and candles arranged for my grandmother's funeral. Instead, I saw my own face staring back at me from a printed memorial program. For a moment I thought I was dreaming. The photograph was the one from the Family Foundation website. Beneath it, in neat black letters, were the words, Adriana Vale, departed from the Vale family. My heart stopped. People were already seated in the pews, heads bowed, programs in hand. My father, Elliot Vale, stood at the podium in his dark suit, speaking in the calm and measured voice he reserved for important occasions. He looked completely at ease, like he had rehearsed this moment 100 times. Then he looked up and said the sentence that shattered my entire world. Our daughter Adriana has chosen to separate herself from the Vale family after her actions brought shame to our name. Heads turned. 50 pairs of eyes found me standing at the back of the aisle. A man in a gray suit began passing papers through the rows. I watched hands reach out and take them. Legal documents. Pages and pages of them. My brother Leon sat in the front row. He never once looked back at me. Then my father's eyes found mine and he said quietly, Adriana, you shouldn't have come. The whisper spread through the church like smoke. Someone near the back held up their phone and photographed me. A woman I had known since childhood turned away when our eyes met. My father continued speaking from the podium, his voice never once breaking. He explained that I had allegedly falsified historic land documents tied to the Vale estate. The estate that had been in our family for 3 generations. The estate that had made the Vale name one of the most respected in the entire region. My mother, Vivian, sat beside Leon in the front pew. When she finally glanced toward me, her expression wasn't angry. It was relieved. That look cut deeper than anything my father had said. The family lawyer, a tall man named Mr. Holt, stood beside the altar in a dark suit, arms folded, face completely blank. His presence there confirmed everything. This had been arranged. I grabbed one of the papers from a nearby pew. My hands were shaking as I flipped through the pages. There were formal legal statements, a detailed confession, documents claiming I had deliberately altered land records to hide evidence of fraud. At the bottom of every single page was my signature. Then I turned to the last document and felt the floor tilt beneath me. It was a legal transfer. My entire inheritance signed away permanently. My name is Adriana Vale, and for 28 years I believed I was exactly that, a Vale through and through. I was the quiet daughter in a family that had built its name on land, money, and reputation. Our estate, Thornfield, sat on over 400 acres just outside the city. It had been photographed for magazines, featured in history books, and used as the foundation for the Vale Family Charitable Trust. My older brother Leon was always the heir, the one my father groomed for leadership, the one my mother dressed in the best clothes and introduced first at every social gathering. I never resented Leon for that. I understood my role. I was the dependable one, the one who quietly handled every detail nobody else wanted to touch. When donors needed follow-up calls, I made them. When estate records needed organizing, I did it. When problems appeared before public events, I solved them before anyone else even knew they existed. I was loyal to that family in ways I cannot fully explain. It was the only life I had ever known. I believed that loyalty meant something to them. I believed it mattered. But 2 weeks before the day I walked into that church and saw my own face on a funeral program, my father had asked me to sign a small stack of what he called routine documents. I trusted him completely. The night my father asked me to sign those documents, he called me into his study after dinner. The room smelled like leather and old wood. A fire was going even though it wasn't particularly cold. He seemed relaxed, almost warm. He placed a neat stack of papers on the desk in front of me. He explained that the Family Foundation was hosting its annual gala in 2 weeks, and that the estate archives needed to be put in proper legal order beforehand. Internal housekeeping, he called it. Nothing complicated. Just signatures confirming that all archived materials were under official family oversight. I asked if I should read through everything first. He smiled and told me it was all standard language. He said the lawyers had already reviewed it 3 times. So I signed every page, without reading a single word. I remember feeling proud that he trusted me with something connected to the estate records. He so rarely included me in anything that felt important. I handed the stack back and he thanked me with a quiet nod before turning back to his fireplace. That was the last normal night of my life. Standing in that church 2 weeks later, holding the forged confession with my signature printed neatly at the bottom, I finally understood exactly what those routine documents had actually been. I left the church before my father could say another word. I couldn't breathe. The morning air outside hit me like cold water, and I stood on the stone steps trying to collect myself while people filed out around me. Some staring, some pretending not to see me at all. I had barely reached my car when my phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. I almost ignored it, but something made me answer. Is this Adriana Vale? The voice was professional and measured. Yes, I said. My name is Calvin Reyes. I'm an investigative journalist. I've been looking into the land acquisition records tied to the Vale estate, specifically documents that appear to have been altered over the past several decades. My stomach dropped straight through the floor. I've been trying to reach your family for comment, he continued, but I wanted to speak with you directly, given your role in managing the archive. I said nothing. I could hear my own breathing. Calvin's voice stayed calm, but the words he said next made my hand tighten around the phone until my knuckles ached. Miss Vale, I want you to know that your family has already issued a statement to my editor. They are claiming that you are personally responsible for altering those documents. I drove to Thornfield the moment I hung up the phone. My mind was racing so fast I barely remembered the route I had driven hundreds of times before. I needed to look my father in the eye. I needed to hear him explain this himself face to face, without an audience watching from the pews. But when I reached the main gate of the estate, the security panel flashed red. I tried my code twice. Nothing. I pressed the intercom button. A security guard I didn't recognize answered. He informed me in a polite but firm tone that my access to the property had been revoked. I asked him when that had happened. He said he wasn't authorized to share that information. I sat in my car staring at the iron gate for a long moment. Then I heard movement above me and looked up. Leon was standing on the stone balcony above the main entrance, looking down at me. He was wearing a suit jacket like he had somewhere important to be. He didn't look angry. He didn't look guilty. He looked completely unbothered. He stood there for a few seconds. Then, just before he turned to go back inside, he said it in a voice flat enough to freeze water. You're not part of this family anymore. The following morning I went to see Mr. Holt. I knew it was probably a mistake. He was the family's lawyer, not mine. But I had no one else to turn to. I had no personal attorney. I had spent my entire adult life trusting the Vale family's legal structure to protect me. His office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown. He kept me waiting for 20 minutes before his assistant led me in. He listened to everything I said without interrupting. When I finished, he folded his hands on the desk and explained very calmly that the documents I had signed 2 weeks ago in my father's study were legally binding. The signature transfers were valid in the eyes of the court. Unless I could prove the signatures were obtained under fraud, there was very little he could do. I told him the signatures were absolutely obtained under fraud. He nodded like I had said something uninteresting. I stood up to leave, furious and hollow at the same time. But then just as I reached the door, he spoke again. His voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. Adriana. He paused. If I were you, I would start asking questions about where that land actually came from in the first place. Then he looked away and said nothing more. Mr. Holt's words followed me out of the building and stayed with me the entire drive across the city. Ask questions about where the land actually came from. I had never thought to question it. Thornfield had always been presented to us as a historic estate that had been in the Vale family for generations. My father spoke about it like it was sacred. My grandfather had spoken about it the same way. But Mr. Holt was the family's own lawyer. He had nothing to gain from sending me in that direction, unless what I might find there was important enough to change everything. The next morning I went to the county records office and asked to review the original land acquisition documents tied to the Thornfield estate. The clerk led me to a reading room and brought out a thick folder of old papers. Some were yellowed and fragile at the edges. I put on the cotton gloves they provided and began reading through them slowly. The documents went back decades. Most of them were in order. Transfer records, tax filings, boundary descriptions. But then I reached the earliest deed in the folder, the very first record of ownership, and stopped cold. The name listed on that document was not Vale. It wasn't even close. I read the name 3 times to make sure I wasn't misreading the faded ink. Valehart. The land had originally belonged to a family called Valehart. Not Vale. Valehart. I had never heard that name in my entire life. Not from my father. Not from my mother. Not from my grandmother, who had told me stories about Thornfield all through my childhood. Not once had anyone ever mentioned the Valeharts. I asked the clerk if there were any additional records connected to that family name. She disappeared into the back for several minutes and returned with a second folder. Inside was an old land ledger from several decades earlier. The handwriting was difficult to read, but the entries were clear enough. The Valehart family had owned and operated the Thornfield estate long before the Vale family was ever connected to the property. There were records of annual tax payments, records of improvements made to the main house, records of crops and livestock. And then, in one single year, everything stopped. No more tax records. No more entries. No more Valeharts anywhere in the ledger. The very next entry showed the estate transferred to the Vale family, with no explanation of what had happened to the original owners. The land had belonged to the Valeharts first. I left the records office with photographs of every relevant page saved on my phone. My head was spinning so fast I sat in my car for 10 minutes before I trusted myself to drive. That afternoon I called Calvin Reyes back. He answered on the second ring. I told him I wanted to meet. He agreed without hesitation. We sat at a coffee shop far from the part of the city where anyone might recognize me. He was younger than I expected. Calm eyes. A worn notebook on the table beside his coffee cup. I listened to everything he had gathered so far. He had been investigating the estate records for 3 months. He had found the same gaps I had just found. He told me that he believed I had nothing to do with the altered documents, that the changes were too sophisticated, too deeply buried in the records, and too old to have been the work of someone my age. He said the trail of original ownership had been deliberately broken. Someone had gone back through decades of records and quietly removed or altered key pages. The kind of work that took years in access. Then he leaned forward slightly and said the thing that made the hair on my arms stand up. The ownership trail ends completely. Like someone tried to erase the real heirs entirely. Calvin and I agreed to share what we found as we went. He had sources I didn't have. I had access to things he could never get on his own, including one thing I had never told anyone about. When I was 10 years old, I used to explore every corner of Thornfield with my grandmother. She was the one who showed me the old servants' entrance on the eastern side of the house, a narrow wooden door hidden behind overgrown hedges that opened into a back corridor no one used anymore. She made me promise never to tell my father about it. I had kept that promise for 18 years. 3 nights after my meeting with Calvin, I drove to Thornfield at midnight. I parked on the old service road behind the tree line and walked the rest of the way on foot. The hedges had grown wilder, but the door was still there. The lock was the original old iron type. The key my grandmother had given me as a child still worked. I moved quietly through the dark back corridor, up 2 flights of narrow stairs, and into the attic. It smelled like dust and old paper. Moonlight came through a small window near the roof. Stacked along the far wall were rows of sealed wooden boxes I had never seen before. I opened the first box carefully. Inside were stacks of envelopes, most of them yellowed with age. Some were bundled with faded ribbon. Others were sealed with wax. I picked up the nearest bundle and unfolded the top letter by the light of my phone. The handwriting was my grandmother's. I recognized it immediately from the birthday card she had written me every year until she passed. The letters spanned decades. Most were addressed to no one in particular. They read more like a private journal written to herself. She wrote about the estate, about the family, about things that kept her awake at night. Then I found the letters that mentioned the Valeharts. She wrote about them carefully, like every word cost her something. She referred to them as the rightful branch. She wrote that the estate had come into the Vale family's possession through means she described as arrangements that were never fully honest. She wrote that a child had survived. And buried near the bottom of the bundle, I found a letter that was different from all the others. The handwriting was shakier, written later in her life. It ended mid-page, like she had stopped herself suddenly. The final line read, "They must never discover the truth about the child." I sat on the dusty attic floor for a long time after reading that line. They must never discover the truth about the child. What child? Whose child? I went through the rest of the box slowly, unfolding every document with steady hands even though my heart was anything but steady. There were more letters, more records, more pages of my grandmother's careful handwriting. And then at the very bottom of the box, I found something that wasn't a letter. It was a sealed hospital record. A formal document with a faded official stamp in the top corner. The kind of record that gets filed once and then locked away somewhere no one ever looks. I opened it. It was a birth record. The year matched my birth year exactly. The hospital name was a small private clinic 2 counties over. Not the hospital my mother had always told me I was born in. I read down the page to the section marked parents. The names listed there were not Elliot Vale and Vivian Vale. They were 2 names I had never seen before in my entire life. I couldn't move. I just sat there while the dust settled around me and the night pressed quietly against the attic window. The person listed as my biological mother shared the surname Valehart. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in my apartment staring at the ceiling with the hospital record on the table beside me, afraid to look at it again and afraid to look away. By morning I had made a decision. There was one person still alive who might be able to tell me the truth. Her name was Rosa Adelman. She had been the head housekeeper at Thornfield for over 30 years before she retired quietly when I was about 12. My grandmother had loved her. I had loved her too. She used to sneak me warm rolls from the kitchen on Sunday mornings. I found her address through an old family directory still saved on my phone. She lived in a small house about an hour outside the city. When I knocked, she opened the door and went completely still. For a moment she just looked at me. Then without a word, she stepped aside and let me in. We sat at her kitchen table. I placed the hospital record in front of her. She looked at it for a long time without touching it. Then she folded her hands and told me everything. I had been brought to Thornfield as a baby. A distant relative had died, she said, and the child had no one. My parents had taken me in secretly. They adopted you, she said softly. But not out of kindness. Rosa poured us both tea. Her hands were steady but her eyes were full of something that looked like guilt carried for a very long time. She told me she had known the truth since I was a baby. My grandmother had confided in her. The 2 of them had kept the secret together for decades because they believed it was the safest thing for me. They thought that as long as I didn't know, I would be protected. I asked her why my parents had really taken me in. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said that when I was brought to Thornfield, the Vale family's legal ownership of the estate was already fragile. There were old questions that had never been properly answered, questions about the original family. My parents had known, even back then, that the Valehart bloodline had not completely disappeared. They had found me, a baby, the last living descendant of that line. And instead of doing the right thing, they had taken me into their home and raised me under their name, not because they wanted a daughter, but because keeping me close and controlled meant the Valehart claim to Thornfield could never be used against them. Rosa looked at me with tired eyes. The bloodline didn't end with the Valeharts, she said. It continued through you. I drove home from Rosa's house in complete silence. No radio. No phone calls. Just the road and the slow, heavy understanding settling into my chest like stone. Over the following days I went back to the county records. I went back to the old ledgers. This time I knew exactly what I was looking for. The full picture came together piece by piece. Decades ago, the Valehart family had owned Thornfield outright. They were the original builders. The estate had been in their family for 2 generations when my great-grandparents appeared. At first it seemed like a business arrangement. The Valeharts were struggling financially and the Valles offered help. But then the Valehart family began disappearing from records. One by one, quietly over a period of several years. No public announcements. No obituaries in the town newspaper. Just an absence where a family used to be. And shortly after that absence became complete, the Vale name appeared on the deed. There was nothing in the records that looked like a legal sale. No purchase agreement. No court transfer. Nothing clean. The estate had not been bought. It had been taken. And according to every layer of property law I could find, The land still legally belonged to the last surviving heir of the original owners. That heir was me. I needed to be absolutely certain before I took another step. Suspicion wasn't enough. Old documents and a housekeeper's memory weren't going to hold up against a family with lawyers and a century of constructed history. I needed proof that was impossible to argue with. I ordered a DNA ancestry test through a private laboratory. I paid for the fastest processing they offered. Then I waited. 12 days later the results arrived in my email. I opened the report at my kitchen table with a glass of water in front of me that I never touched. The test confirmed what the hospital record had suggested. My biological lineage did not trace back to the Vale family at all. The genetic markers pointed to a separate bloodline, one that aligned precisely with the regional origin connected to the Vale Hart family records I had been studying. I sat there reading and rereading the results until the words stopped blurring. There was no longer any question. I was not Adriana Vale in any biological sense. I had never been a Vale. I was a Vale Hart, the last living one, the only surviving descendant of the family whose land had been taken, whose history had been buried, and whose name had been scrubbed from every record my adoptive family could reach. I went back to the attic twice more over the following week. Each visit I brought another box down and went through it carefully at home. The more of my grandmother's letters I read, the clearer the picture became. She had known the full truth for most of her adult life. She wrote about it in fragments, never all in one place, never in a way that could be used against her while she was alive. But taken together, the letters told a complete story. She had watched the estate change hands. She had been young when it happened but old enough to understand that something was deeply wrong. She had lived with that knowledge for decades, and she described it as a weight she could never put down no matter how hard she tried. When I was brought to Thornfield as a baby, she recognized immediately what I represented. She understood that I was the missing piece, the one person whose existence could unravel everything her own family had built. She had protected me quietly, kept me close, left me the servant's entrance key, hidden the documents in the attic where only someone who knew the house well would ever find them. And in her final months, Rosa had told me, my grandmother had tried to contact someone outside the family to expose the truth. She died before she could finish. I called Calvin Reyes the morning after I finished reading the last of my grandmother's letters. We met at the same coffee shop. This time I brought everything: the hospital record, the DNA results, the ledger photographs, the key letter extracts. I laid it all out on the table between us and watched his expression shift from focused to stunned. He told me that his investigation had taken an unexpected turn too. 3 months ago, an anonymous source had contacted his editor with a tip. The tip claimed that the Vale estate had a surviving legitimate heir, someone whose existence the family had been hiding for decades. That tip was the reason Calvin had started investigating in the first place. Someone had deliberately started the chain of events that led to my family's panic. I asked Calvin if he knew who the source was. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the tip had come through a legal office connected to estate and inheritance law. I thought about Mr. Holt standing beside the altar at the church. His blank face. His whispered words when I was leaving his office. Start asking questions about where that land actually came from. My parents hadn't just framed me to cover up old crimes. They had framed me because they were terrified the truth was already coming, and they needed someone to blame first. I stopped feeling afraid somewhere around this point. The fear had burned through me completely, and what was left on the other side was something much calmer and much more focused. I had the hospital record. I had the DNA results. I had the original land ledger photographs showing the Vale Hart name. I had my grandmother's letters describing the transfer of the estate in terms that left no honest interpretation. I had Calvin's documentation of the altered records. I had the forged confession my father had circulated at the church, which, now that I had proof of my true identity, was clearly defamation. I spent 2 weeks organizing everything into a clear and thorough legal file. I consulted a property law attorney named Mr. Calloway, who reviewed the full collection of materials carefully, and told me that my case was stronger than almost anything he had worked on in his career. Then, while I was building my case quietly, the Vale family made a very public announcement. They were expanding Thornfield, a major development project, new construction on the outer land, investor partnerships. A celebration of the Vale legacy, they called it. A gala was planned for the following month, the largest public event the family had hosted in years. My father was positioning himself for a triumphant moment. I decided I would let him have his stage. The formal invitations went out 2 weeks before the gala. I heard about the event through Calvin, who had received a press invitation. The Vale family was presenting it as a celebration of the estate's history and a launch for the development project. Investors had been invited, local officials, journalists, old family friends, the kind of crowd my father had always performed best in front of. I assumed I would not receive an invitation. I was wrong. 3 days after Calvin told me about the event, a cream-colored envelope arrived at my apartment. No return address. Just my name in the formal printed script the Vale family used for all their official correspondence. I opened it slowly. Inside was a gala invitation, crisp and expensive as always. Every detail was printed in gold ink. The date, the venue, the dress code, and at the top, where the guest name was printed, the words read, "For the attention of former daughter Adriana Vale." I read that line twice. Then I set the invitation on my kitchen counter and looked at it for a long time. My father had sent it deliberately. It was a message, not an invitation. He wanted me to know that he was untouchable, that he had already won. He wanted me to feel small. Instead, I started deciding what to wear. I arrived at Thornfield on the night of the gala exactly 45 minutes after the event began. I dressed carefully. Simple, dark, composed. No jewelry except the small silver bracelet my grandmother had given me the year before she died. I carried a slim leather folder under my arm. The grounds were lit with hundreds of warm lights strung through the old oak trees. Music drifted softly from inside the main hall. Valets moved between expensive cars in the long driveway. People recognized me the moment I stepped into the entrance hall. The first cluster of guests near the door went quiet. Then the silence spread like something dropped into still water, moving outward in rings through the crowd until the entire room had slowed to a murmur. My father was standing near the center of the hall with a small group of investors. He saw me at the same moment the room noticed me. Something moved across his face, just a flicker there and gone. Then he put his smile back on and crossed the room toward me. He stopped about 3 feet away. His voice was quiet, but the edge in it was sharp enough to cut. "You have no place here, Adriana." I looked at him calmly and said, "I think you'll find that's the one thing you have always been wrong about." I had arranged everything with Calvin in advance. He was already in the room when I arrived. His editor was with him. Mr. Calloway stood near the back wall with a colleague. 3 other journalists Calvin trusted were positioned at different points through the crowd. I walked to the small raised stage at the front of the hall where the family's presentation podium was set up. My father called after me. I heard Leon's voice somewhere behind me. I heard my mother say my name in a tone that was more alarmed than angry. I stepped onto the stage. The room went completely still. I opened the leather folder and placed the documents on the podium. Then I spoke clearly without rushing, in a voice steady enough to reach every corner of the hall. I told them who I was. Not who they had told me I was, but who I actually was. I showed the DNA results. I showed the original Vale Heartland deed. I showed the birth record. I read 2 lines from my grandmother's own letters. And then I held up the forged confession my father had passed through the church pews and explained exactly how it had been created using documents I had been tricked into signing. The investors near the back began exchanging looks. The room understood what it was hearing. The Vale estate had been built on stolen land. Everything happened quickly after that night, and then slowly, and then all at once. Within 48 hours of the gala, Calvin's article had been published. It included photographs of the original documents, a summary of the DNA findings, and a detailed timeline showing how the Vale Hart family had disappeared from the records and the Vale family had taken their place. 3 national outlets picked up the story by the end of the week. Mr. Calloway filed the formal legal claim on my behalf the following Monday. The court ordered an immediate freeze on the estate development project, while the land ownership dispute was under investigation. 2 of the major investors withdrew within 10 days. The charitable foundation connected to the Vale name issued a statement saying it was pausing all operations pending the outcome of the legal process. My father hired 4 new lawyers. Leon gave a brief public statement denying everything. My mother said nothing at all publicly, which in some ways felt like the loudest response of all. 3 weeks after the gala, I received a message through my attorney. It was from Leon. 4 words. What do you want from us? I read it standing in my kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I set my phone down. I poured my coffee. I looked out the window at the street below. And then I wrote back. I told Leon the truth. The same truth I had been carrying since the night I found my grandmother's letters in the attic. I didn't want revenge. I had never wanted revenge. What I had wanted from the very beginning was simply to be seen clearly. To have the lie corrected. To have my name mean something honest again. The legal process took several months. The court reviewed every document, every record, every piece of evidence Mr. Calloway had assembled. In the end, the ruling was straightforward. The original transfer of the Thornfield estate had no valid legal basis. The land belonged to the last surviving heir of the Veilhart family. That heir was me. I did not keep the estate. I sold Thornfield to a heritage preservation organization that converted it into a public historic site open to anyone who wanted to visit. With a portion of the proceeds, I established a foundation. I named it the Veilhart Foundation, in honor of the family whose name had been buried for decades. My parents lost everything they had built on that land. Leon lost the inheritance he had been groomed his entire life to receive. They watched it all disappear, not through cruelty on my part but through justice. I walked away from Thornfield on the last day without looking back. They had used me to protect their legacy, but the truth was the one thing they could never control.